Hello and welcome to GryphonArt. So today I want to show you how to make these little Fleur De Lis out of cold porcelain. Now for consistency of size I am going to be using this template here, but that is downloadable for free from my website at gryphonart.co.uk, and I will put a link in the description area so that you can find that very easily. Also, in order to enable me to use that template, I am going to be needing a little bit of cellophane, and this is just what's come with a greetings card, so I'm just going to lay that on the surface there. Now this project does come together in phases, and the first thing that we're going to be working on are these little outside curl sections, and specifically the small curl. So I'm just going to move these out of the way to start with so that we've got a bit more working space. Now I have included a number of shapes on this table just in case you find a different method of working that suits you better. But for these little curl sections I do find it easier to work with this bottom image here. So that's where I'm going to be starting. Now the other thing that I do in order to help me maintain that size consistency is to weigh my wet cold porcelain for each section, and I'm just using this digital scale here for that purpose. Now the other thing that you might like to have available when working with cold porcelain is some sort of cold cream, because that does overcome some of the sticky aspect of cold porcelain. Now I just tend to use a Nivea cream for that, so you know, you can choose other cold creams, but that's the one that I've always used. So the first piece of cold porcelain that I'm going to be using is actually 1 gram in weight. And the first thing that I need to do is simply roll that into a little ball, and then I'm going to start to form a cone shape with that as well. Just a little one to create a sort of tail section that can go around. So that's sort of what you're aiming for in the first place, and that is going to be settled just onto this section of the template here. Now what you're aiming to do is to end this curl within this band section, because the band section will go over the top and hide any join between the two curls. So that's sort of what you're doing. The first thing that I do as well is I start to draw down the edges so that the outside of that porcelain actually touches the bottom of the template, just has a flat edge on here so there's not any gaps underneath it. And then I'm simply going to take a balling tool, and I'll use some of that Nivea cream with my balling tools just to stop it from sticking. And I'm just going to start to push that cold porcelain into the shape that I want. Okay. And just start to form that sort of top edge. You end up with this ridge on the top edge as well, keeping that outside neat. And then you can use a smaller ball. I've got one on the other end of here, so I'm just going to start to create this sort of curl shape in here as well, and bring that to a point. And you just keep working that shape in that way until you are happy with it. So I'll try and bring this closer up to the camera. When I've sort of got a basic shape, I will probably work it a little bit more off camera because I can see it better when I'm off camera, and obviously I don't want the porcelain to dry out too much. So I'm hoping that that's enough just to give you the idea that that is how you form that shape. And you just want to make sure that you are not going beyond the edge of that band. So let me just bring that up to the camera so that you can see what you're aiming for. All right, so once you've achieved that, you need to do a second one for this side, and then you need to leave them to dry off a bit. The reason for that is if we start to work on this curl now, it's going to be, we want to join the two together, and whilst we're working here you're likely to nudge this one out of shape. So that's why I've opted to do these separately. Initially I tried to do them in one piece and it simply didn't work for me. So that's the method in my madness. So I will now get that other curl completed off camera, and then I'll allow them to dry off enough so that I can start working on the larger curl, and I'll come back to you at that stage. Okay, so that's those two little curls created, and I've just left them for about 4 hours so that they start to form a fairly hard crust on the surface. And what that means is if I happen to knock them whilst I'm working on the larger curl, it's not going to create any damage. Now, just so that you know, they are actually nowhere near dry. I'll just move that one to one side. If I just show you underneath, you'll see that the porcelain is still quite wet. So it's just a crust that forms on the surface in those few hours, all right? And that, as I say, allows us to move on to work with the next curl. Now, for that larger curl, we are going to be needing a piece of cold porcelain that is 2.5 grams in weight. The method for creating that curl is pretty much the same, but I am going to demonstrate it simply because there are just tiny little differences that may help you have success. Okay, so we are going to be starting out the same, just with a ball of cold porcelain, and then we are also going to be creating a cone shape to create a tail. Now you do need to consider that the curl on this one is significantly more than the curl on the small, or the tail rather, on the small curl. So you just need to roll that out accordingly. Okay, and then you can, in fact, if you wanted to offer it up to get an idea of whether you're on target, as that one is, you can see that's about on target. So I'm now going to also just form a curl, a little tail on the other end, because we've got this curly section going on here. So the bulk of that ball is actually going to be in this area here, if that's any help to you. So once again, I shall line up my template, that little curl, so that I know where I'm working. And I'm just going to put that roughly in place. You know, I'll be using my balling tool. You can see that's short, it doesn't matter. I can drag that porcelain with my balling tool, so it's not really too much of a problem. So let's get on with that so that you can see how that goes. There. In fact, I'll use a smaller one, I think, to start with. So I'm just going to push and nudge, really. That's what I find. I think if you haven't seen some of my other videos, it's something that I find with cold porcelain. It's really about just pushing it into place. You're not really carving into it or anything like that. You're just pushing it where you want to go. So having got it more or less into place, I'm going to do the same thing, sort of push these outer edges down so that they are forming a flat layer on the base. I'll just pull that out again towards that other piece. I do want to join these two curls together. They won't be separate, they will be joined together. You can also shift just to see where you are on that template, just in case you're slightly bigger, because if you can't see the outline, you've got no idea what that size is like. So, and you can see how little gap you've got here to work with. Now, there is another couple of tools that I use, and I would say definitely if you want to create this piece, you are going to need some tools, and I really can't imagine how you would go about achieving this particular piece without a balling tool. So just bear that in mind. You will need certain tools to have some success with this. It's not as easy, ever as easy when I'm on camera. So at this point, I can see that that's coming into the area of that other one. I don't want it to go beyond this this band here, because as you remember from earlier, that's going to hide that join. But I do want to get a join going on there so that I know it's all where it needs to be. And then you're basically doing as you did before, just forming that that sort of bevel shape on the inside, keeping the outside rounded, bevel shape on the inside. Now, there is one thing I didn't say to you earlier. What is another thing? If when you spread this down at the back, you've got little bits that are sticking out, it's worth just using a tool to tuck them underneath. That sort of creates quite a nice edge. So that's something else for you to consider doing. The other thing is, think about your heights. you know, just check how high you want this piece in comparison to this one. And you know, when you come to make your second curl, make sure that they are similar heights, because it's going to look very odd if you've got one curl that's significantly higher than the other. So those are just things for you to consider. All right, so I think that's enough. If I lift that up to the camera, it's not neat at the moment, but I need to get off camera to get closer to it, to see it, to tidy that up. But if you just keep using your balling tool, you can neaten all of those edges up, and you'll end up with something you can then leave to thoroughly dry. All right, so once you've done one, you do the other curl as well, leave them to dry. That's what I shall do now, and then I shall come back to you when I've got to that stage. Okay, so I know that I said that I would come back to you when these curls had thoroughly dried out. You can see from the difference in shade of the larger curl and the little one that I've only just finished them. I was just forgetting that actually, whilst these are drying out, we can also work on this center section here as well, because there's an awful lot of cold porcelain in that section, and if we built that as one solid piece, you know, it's going to take forever to dry out. So it is actually worth starting that off, because if we've got to let these dry, we may as well also let this section dry and give us some firm base to work with. So all we're going to do is just pre-build that smaller than the finished section. Let's just move these out of the way so that we can gain access to the template again. So the weight of the cold porcelain that we're using for this initial build is actually 2 grams, and I am going to use another piece of cellophane here. I will be able to lift this off. It's got a bit of curl in it actually. I think it'll be all right. There we go. I hope you can see that with the glare. Yeah. So again, what we're doing is we're going to be building, I'll show you here. We're going to be building inside this outline down to this section here. It can go beyond, because we will build the whole of this section here, but in the interest of keeping it a similar size, you want to get into the habit of always finishing in and around the same space. Right, so all we're going to do, I'll start off by rolling that cold porcelain. It doesn't have to be perfect, so in fact I could put a bit of a bevel on either end, because that's going to start giving us that shape. And all I'm going to do, I don't want to go into that very tip section. I don't even need to form a tip. I'm just going to start to draw that porcelain down and form a shape. And I'm going to give a central ridge, because that's going to give us something to finish against. When we get our next layer of cold porcelain on this, this will be dry, so it will form that natural height. We won't need to add much to it, if that makes sense. So as you can see, I'm going to keep it thin in this section here. I've got to be able to cover it again. So I'm just going to gradually pull on that tail effectively. We're making like a tadpole in a way. So, and it doesn't have to really be too much of a consistent size all of the time. It's just that you're wanting to give yourself a foundation layer for when you're ready to actually finish your piece. Now, don't be tempted to put too much of a tip on this section, because it will have the tendency to curl upwards if you do. So keep that rounded at this stage and just put a ridge on the top, checking that that's not higher than you want your finished piece to be. Obviously it will shrink back, so you've got a lot of things to think about when you're working with cold porcelain. And I will show you the difference in those curl sizes, which will give you an idea of just how much the cold porcelain does shrink back. Now, you don't have to be too fussy about this piece at all, but you know, just depends how pedantic you are. I tend to be a little bit pedantic, I confess. So you see I've gone down into that tip section, still within that band which will cover the join, although as I say, it doesn't really matter as long as you keep it low, because you can cover it when you come to build a piece, and you'll cover it with whatever porcelain you're using here. So it's not too much of an issue if you go below in this particular instance. So that's all you're doing, providing a nice ridge section, and I'll bring that up to the camera for you in a minute. That's just going to help you once that's formed for the second layer of the build. can pinch it a bit if you want. Okay, so let me bring that up to the camera so that you can see I'm well within that outline there. Hope you can see that. So I've got about 1 millimeter to work with when I come to build up my second layer. All right, so with that done, again, you can just leave that overnight with the 2 curls and come back to them to finish off tomorrow. Okay, so before I leave you for this phase, I did say that I would show you the difference in the size of the wet porcelain and the dry, and that will give you an idea of just how much it shrinks, and I'm hoping that you can see that. So this is thoroughly dry now on this particular Fleur De Lis, and this is our wet section, and you can see there is going to be significant amount of shrinkage. It's the same weight of porcelain that I've used, so it will be the same size, but as you can see, it will need to shrink back quite a lot. So if you're not familiar with cold porcelain, the shrinkage of cold porcelain has its advantages, because if you want something that's detailed, that's small, you know it's going to shrink back, and it gives you that extra sort of ability to get that fine detail in. But it does have its problems as well, so just be aware of that. Okay, so I shall come back to you tomorrow after I have given those pieces a chance to dry out. All right, so I'll come back to you again soon. Okay, so these pieces have now gone overnight, and whilst they are nowhere near dry, the surface is hard enough to allow me to gently peel these sections off the cellophane and reposition them so that they can start to form that complete shape. And that's the first thing that I want to do, is to reposition this piece onto the template where I know that the complete shape will also be able to be placed on a complete piece of cellophane. Where this was located on this tiny bit of cellophane, I'll just show you. That whole design will not fit on that piece of cellophane. So at this stage, you need to know that the whole design will fit onto the cellophane. Now, in order to complete this top section, we are going to need a piece of cold porcelain that is 2.5 grams in weight. So all I'm going to start to do is to flatten that into a shape that I can start to form over this existing shape. It just saves a bit of time if you start to work out the shape in advance. So, we're looking about somewhere in the region of. So if I just lay that over the top of that existing shape and just start to push that around where it needs to be. So we're really just doing what we did earlier, but this time around we are working to the exact size of the template. And because of having done what we did yesterday, we've got a solid base to work with. You can definitely feel a difference with working with something that has a solid foundation at its base. So I am now starting to form that point. I can use some of my tools as well, they do help. I love this little tool, it's very useful. I don't know whether you've seen it on my videos before, but it's like a golf club at one end and it's sort of pointing the other way out the other. It's very useful. So, as I say, do invest in some tools if you're going to do a lot of cold porcelain work. So I just need to push that in. And again, I don't now want to extend beyond the base of this band. I prefer it that way simply because at this stage I'm tending to form the finished height. So if I've already got the height here, there's nowhere for that join to go when I'm joining this bottom section. So it's always a good precaution for me just to stick within that band. So that's all that you're doing. You're forming that ridge line. Now if you did want to emphasize that ridge line, you can do that by using a balling tool and just taking it along the edge of that line, and that will start to emphasize it a little bit. So, you know, it's entirely up to you whether you want to do that. But have a play. You know, this is sort of creative. Sorry, I need to try and do this in a way that you can also see it's quite difficult. In fact, a larger balling tool might be easier. So, just to make some cold cream on that, sticking a bit. So it just helps to just nudge that porcelain in place sometimes, but I'll leave you to play and decide how you want to do. You can basically see that I'm getting that shape, and that's all you're working to, as we've done before, sticking to the template size, making sure that you're within those lines, and then I leave this at this stage to dry off for a while. Now that's not entirely necessary. If you feel confident that you can build this next section without knocking this top section, you know, feel free to just move on straight away. I prefer not to do that simply because when you're working with pieces like this, I do find with the best of intentions, it's so easy to knock this upper shape. So I am going to leave that for maybe a couple of hours, and then at that stage I'll come back to you and we can finish things off. Right, so the next piece of cold porcelain that we're going to need is going to be 1.5 grams in weight. Now the first thing that I'm going to be doing is to create a basic cross shape that I can work with, because we're going to be ending up with this sort of cross shape at the bottom here. So it's simply a question of squeezing in the corners so that you're making a bit of a square, and then you can press down, and you're just going to make one of those ends longer because you've got this little bit of a tail going on. So you're just trying to emulate the shape that you've got at the bottom of that piece to give you a head start, really. So I'm still keeping quite a bit of height on there, so I hope you can see that. So at that stage we can then look to try and start to join that to this existing piece. Now, one thing I didn't mention before is that you can use a little bit of water. I'm just going to get some, not too much, but if you're at all worried that you're not going to get a good join between your dry cold porcelain and your wet cold porcelain, just the tiniest amount of water will provide a bit of stickiness that you otherwise won't have. So, you know, that's another option for you. So I'm just going to put that in and around the region that it needs to be. So hopefully you can see that, and then I can start to work it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is start to form a bit of a join with that other piece and try and establish that height as well. So, and then just push that more into the space where it needs to be. Need to try and make sure as well that I maintain on the template. So, you know, you can, it's about pushing and pulling the porcelain around really in this instance until you're sort of happy that it's roughly where it needs to be. So once you've got a rough positioning of it, at this point, this is where you really need to have a ball tool. So I'm going to just sort that out. So I've applied some Nivea cream to my ball tool, both ends, because I will probably use both sizes of ball tool here, just to stop any stickiness going on, and I shall start to just work that piece a little. I can pull as well if I need to. You know, you'll find your own method, but what you want to do here, you're trying to create initially a bevel, and you do want quite a nice defined ridge at the top here as well. So just use your ball tool to just drag that porcelain into position, you know, wherever it's missing. And it does take a little bit of working. You're probably going to go over this quite a bit. I hope you can still see there. I can pull these out as well a bit. It's always difficult. on camera. I hope you can get the gist of that. So I'm going to swap to my smaller tool now, because that's going to help me get some of this definition in here. And I can always, the smaller the balling tool, it will leave little lines, so you might have to finish off with a larger one at the end, but it does have more power of pull, I find. I hope you can start to see how that's shaping up. Okay, so that's basically what you're doing. Now again, if the shape at the bottom here is not behaving itself, it's sort of moving beyond the sides of the template where you want it, then do use your other tools, so things like this, just to push it back in where it needs to be, that sort of thing. And certainly what I would say, if you are looking at investing in some tools, definitely I would recommend some silicone tools. I'll just show you some of those actually. So these sorts of tools, there's a silicone. Again, I still use cold cream with them to stop any stickiness, but they are really brilliant tools at trying to push that porcelain around. And I've got this one that I particularly like because it's like a paintbrush. It's brilliant. So you can just sort of push the porcelain where it needs to be. So I'm going to continue to do that off camera because I really just, it's just easier when you can get your head above the piece and work it. But I hope that you've got the gist of what I'm actually doing here. And you know, I need to, you can see that that's too small for that piece. I need to draw that out a bit more. So I'm going to work on that, doing the same thing just over and over again off camera until I'm happy with that shape, and then I'll come back to you. Right, so now that that central section has actually been finished and it's had some time to just harden off a bit, we can look at starting to put the Fleur De Lis together. So the final piece of cold porcelain that we are requiring needs to be 1 gram in weight. Now in the first instance, we are just going to be taking a tiny little piece off that 1 gram piece of cold porcelain, and we're going to be using this to stick the curls into place. Now once again, we may benefit from using just a tiny amount of water on the edge, so I'll just get a little bit of water first into my brush. So here we go. So I'm just going to put a little bit of water over the edge of that join area and where that band needs to be, and that should re-moisten that porcelain and make it a little bit tacky. That's going to help with the adhesion of the piece that we're trying to join. So I'm just going to put that on that very edge within that band space, and I'm just going to create a little bit of a layer there that we can put the curl up against. So I just need my curl next, and we can see where that join is on that curl. This is still not dry if I show you. So it's still got some shrinking to do, but we can see where that join needs to be. So that does help us to line everything up in the first instance. And you can already see that that started to shrink back on that template as it's drying. But that's just going to give us a little bit of spacing away. So that's all we're doing. So we'll do the same. I won't go off camera because it doesn't take long. So I'm just going to do exactly the same on the other side. So just a tiny little piece to start with. That may even be a little bit big actually, but we'll see. We'll see. So I just want to put that into place here. Just want to tuck that up a bit as well, because when the band goes on, I don't want that to be showing. So there we are. So just get the next little curl. Again, check where that joiners here so that we know where to line that up roughly. And again, just push it into place. And try and just check, sort of stand back and look at the shape and make sure you've got some symmetry going on. You know, don't just rely on the template itself, because these shapes can shrink back slightly differently. So just take a look at them and see how you're feeling about it. So yeah, I'm reasonably happy with that. So the next thing that we're going to do is to form a shape that will create our band. So if we roll our remaining porcelain up and just, you know, roll it out like we did when we were kids, really. So many years ago, wow. Right, so we're going to get a length. It will be longer than it looks here because obviously it's got to curl over the sides as well. So, you know, you can just have a look and see. We can push it later anyway. And then we're just going to curl that over the top initially. Nice and evenly on both ends. Now at this point we can take our balling tool and we're just going to start to push. Actually, I'll use that larger one. Just find out what you're happier with. I'm just going to push in the middle there, just knocking it down really to start with. I'll revert to the little one now. Got started. Pushing in until you can start to form sort of a little central curved indentation here. And if you feel some of these are pushing out too much, you can get another tool and just push them back a bit again. And it doesn't have to be this tool in particular, you know. Sometimes I use my brush style tools. So I can push that back with that, you know, whichever you're comfortable with really. So I'll just have another go. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get a tool that I can just tuck that edge under. So I'm going to start to push that underneath those curls. And I'll just bring that up to the camera so that you can see the difference. If you start to just tuck that underneath and force this sort of curl section, it starts to give you a better definition of that curl on these ends, which you also want. Can you see the difference between the two ends? So you're just pushing in and underneath to tuck that porcelain underneath. It's going to start to attach it to the curl as well, which is going to strengthen it. So that's what we're doing. So I'll do the same this end. It's not attaching very well. There. If it's sticking to your tool, just use your cold cream. Just try and prevent that. Oops. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is to start to make a line down the centre there. So I'll just now just going to make with this pencil tool, or you could use a straight edge blade or something like that, just marking sort of a centre line and pushing that porcelain down in that very centre again. I also just use this tiny balling tool just to encourage that back. So it is, as with all things. It's a bit of a, just to keep coaxing it into place, you just work it till you're happy with it. And that's just giving it a bit more definition. So I hope that's sort of enough for you to understand what you're trying to do and give you something to aim for in order to achieve the final shape. Not quite right, you feel it's not in the right place, just have another go with the balling tool and continue on in that vein. So I'm going to, I think this is not as neat as it can be, but it'll give you an idea. So that's really the end of this tutorial. I will obviously finish that off camera, and then it's just a case of leaving it to dry, and then, you know, you've got your Fleur De Lis. So that just leaves me to thank you for watching this video. I do appreciate your support. Don't forget, if you need to have that template, that is available from GryphonArt.co.uk, and the link should be in the description area for you. So thank you again for watching, and hopefully you'll join me on a future occasion.